folks. We'll let you catch your breath for a second, but please welcome back to the stage director Avi Nesher.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Avi.
So, everybody okay?
Everyone's good. We'll let you catch your breath for a second. So I'll ask a few questions and we'll turn to the audience in a little bit. But first, I was wondering, you talked a little bit about this before the film started, but where did you get the idea for this film originally? Like, where did you hear the story, and then what made you want to turn it into a film?
Well, I was always very interested in the inception of Israel, because Israel is a wondrous place. I mean, there's no country in the world that came to being out of an idea. You know, immigrant nations, people immigrate to America, to Australia, to New Zealand out of economic need, the Irish potato famine, Italians, Polish people, Chinese. This country came about through an idea, and it came into being through great violence and through these underground organizations that you can call freedom fighters or terrorists. In the 80s, when the Israeli army went into Lebanon, it was, you know, for people such as myself who fought in the Yom Kippur War and the attrition war, and, you know, some were decorated. I mean, for us, it was the only bad war, militarily speaking, not even morally speaking. I mean, we were no pacifists, but we found fault with taking the campaign into the enemy's home court. It was against the way we were taught how to conduct warfare. And I thought it would be very interesting to understand the mentality of these kids, and they were very, very young, who fought the British against all odds in the 40s, because we were very much like them. We were taught to fight down, you know, the few against the many, and in many ways to try to eliminate maybe what Israel was doing wrong during the 80s, and that's one of the reasons the movie was so controversial.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about that as well. So when the film came out, could you describe, I guess, what your reaction to this controversy was in terms of, you know, right when it came out, I guess?
Well, it was insane, because before this I made two hugely popular movies, kind of semi-lighthearted. And this was very somber, and this was very hard-hitting, and this, you know, won many international festivals. But in Israel, the left took it as a right-wing film because, you know, of Yitzhak Shamir, who was in the Lehi, and the right took it as a pro-PLO movie because they figured it was, you know, if we have the right to blow up buildings and people, why shouldn't they? And the controversy just raged on and on and on for weeks. I mean, you couldn't open a newspaper without an op-ed from the left, an op-ed from the right, and it really got pretty dull at some point. It was very, very intense.
Mm-hmm. And so what was it like for you, I guess, going from Dizengoff 99 and The Troop and these lighter films? Like, what made you, I guess, switch over to something as intense as this film?
I didn't see it as, I mean, you know, I always make movies about groups. I always do ensemble pieces. And I didn't see it as a switch. I always react to where I am when the country is. I always try to ask questions that bother me. So I didn't see it. You know, I mean, for me, it was The Troop without guitars, you know, or without funny people. Mm-hmm. But for me, I mean, you know, in Israel, the operating term is we, as opposed to the American I, right? I mean, in Israel, we do not really believe in the pursuit of happiness. You know, we believe in the greater good of the community, the country, the kibbutz, you know, whatever. And at some point, there's a great clash between the I and the we within the Israeli mentality as the country matures. So I've always dealt with the Israeli we colliding with the Israeli I, and I didn't see it as all that different from my other movies, but it's really that timing, the 80s. I mean, the movie really just, and it's interesting, you know, because this movie is now being taught in Israel film schools for the aesthetics. You know, I mean, it's really beautifully shot, and the whole usage of black and people disappearing into the dark and coming back, and you know, I mean, the war in Lebanon is gone, and people don't commemorate it like this, the 6-Day War, even the Yom Kippur War. You know, it's the forgotten war. And right now, I mean, and I do a lot of master classes with students who just go on about the aesthetics of this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm wondering too, I guess, after, you know, obviously again it was controversial when it came out, and there was like maybe backlash to it. How do you feel about it now, after it's been so many years after, and how it fits into your career?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of retrospectives of my work recently. This gets shown a lot in this country with the Battle of Algiers. I actually, after 9/11, Lincoln Center had put together a retrospective of the 10 best political movies ever made, and I think they picked this as one of them. And it was shown right after Bertolucci's The Conformist. So it's interesting to see how a movie finds its place within a cinematic universe, and it's never exactly what you intend it to be. A movie is very much like a child, and it kind of finds its own way in the world. But I just find it really interesting how this movie has become about whether ideology drives violence or whether violence drives ideology. The Israeli foreign prime minister Ehud Barak said that had he been a Palestinian, 20 years ago, he would join the Hamas.
Yeah.
And I understand it. At some point, I mean, you've all seen Fauda, right? And Fauda is basically gang warfare. I mean, nobody's particularly right, nobody's particularly wrong, and a lot of people get killed along the way. And it's like, the Western in this country. The Western used to be about good guys and bad guys, and then when the spaghetti Westerns came along, it's about the bad guys and the worst guys.
Yeah.
Right. It's just an evolution. So I found it very flattering when this was picked as one of the 10 best Israeli movies of all time, and I got a chuckle out of it because how times change.
Yeah, for sure. I guess also one thing that's so interesting about the film is within the group of the Stern Gang, you kind of do get to see everyone's different characters come out and kind of see their humanity in different ways in terms of characters who are obviously like Eddie the Butcher, where they're so intense and it's very like mission focused, whereas and then there's Pinocchio, who's kind of clearly dealing with like the trauma kind of what's going on around them. And again, like the humanity of each character is something that's really interesting throughout the film.
Well, my wife claims that in Annie the Butcher, this is as close as me doing an autobiography. I guess I get pretty scary on a movie set. but the interesting thing is the guy playing Eddie the Butcher, is half Arabic, half Jewish. And this was his first role ever. And this guy showed tremendous promise. And after the movie was out, I was invited by Dion De Laurentiis to make a science fiction movie for MGM. And he was invited to be signed by all the great agencies of Hollywood, like as the next Antonio Banderas. And he refused to go. And interestingly enough, and really sadly enough, he was killed 10 years ago. Exactly in the same way that he is killed in the movie. He was killed on the West Bank. He was running a children's theater in Jenin, a Palestinian town, and he was killed by murderers unknown, but he was mowed down, exactly like in the movie. And I spoke in his funeral. I could barely speak. I mean, he was a man I loved dearly, but he had a short and very violent life.
Yeah. If anyone from the audience has questions now, I love to take them. Yara will be coming around with the mic.
Thank you very much. It was a very exciting film. I'm sorry, I'm on the aesthetic side at this point.
Good.
I was watching the film, and certainly your use of light and shadow is really remarkable. In fact, as I was watching some of the earlier scenes, the thought of Casablanca came into my head. And then, of course, there's a shot of the poster of Casablanca. Then we also have Humphrey Bogart in a picture in Angela's room. Right. So, to some extent, was this an homage to Casablanca or Humphrey Bogart?
It's not really an homage. I mean, when I was 18, I served in a special forces unit, which in many ways is a little bit like the Stern Gang, in a way that you are quite likely to get killed. So, I mean, you just do really dangerous things. And the whole notion of heroism is something that we get culturally. I mean, we get out of books, and we get most powerfully out of cinema. And there's a whole generation who grew up on this Humphrey Bogart lore, I mean, doing heroic things, Casablanca, he lets Claude Rains and Ingrid Bergman get on the plane, he stays behind. So the whole notion of heroism, is something which is driven culturally. And for me, I mean, this movie kind of ends badly because they all get killed, and yet a state is born. So, I mean, the reference to Casablanca is a reference to the cultural heritage that basically, makes people like myself join a really dangerous quest at the, the very early age of 18. And it's not quite so much an homage, but a dialogue with a culture that makes this kind of behavior possible.
We have one more in the middle.
So the film is set during World War II, and the point is made at the beginning that Rommel's army is heading to Palestine.
Right.
So the implication is that were the British to have left, then the Germans would have taken Palestine, and the Jews would have been the victims. Is that a point you intended to make?
Well, that was a historical reality at that time. Part of the reason, I mean, historically speaking, the Haganah and the Irgun, because Rommel was advancing toward Palestine, they stopped fighting the British, and they joined up. They joined the British Army, the Jewish Brigade, all that kind of stuff. The Lehi, the Stern Gang, took exception to it because they said, with all the respect to the British effort, Jews are being massacred in Europe, and no one is allowing Jews to go to Palestine or to this country for that effect, And at this point, I mean, we now know that Roosevelt knew about the concentration camps, and Churchill knew about the concentration camps, and we know that no concerted effort was made to stop it, the way nobody made an effort to stop the massacre in Syria, on this decade. World leaders do not seem to care that much about massacres when they happen far from their home country. So I always sympathized with the Lehi. The interesting thing about the Lehi gave birth to the extreme Israeli left and the extreme Israeli right. So the man who started the Israeli Communist Party, his name is Nathaniel Linmor, was a Lehi member. And of course, Yitzhak Shamir, who was very much part of the Cherut Party and Menachem Begin's partner, came from Lehi. And in many ways, they were the only ones who understood that the problem is not really Rommel. The problem is 6 million Jews being destroyed on the continent. And they fought for one reason. They didn't fight to drive the British out of Palestine. Actually, many of us regret that the British are no longer in Palestine, The idea was to open the gates. The idea was to create a safe haven for Jews who were being... And all of those infamous stories about ships being turned back and sent back to Europe, to certain deaths. So while Rommel was a danger, there was a greater danger on the continent, and this is what the Stern Gang focused on.
So I'm sitting here somewhat traumatized because it was so graphically bloody. So I'm wondering if there was, that was a clear choice to quite have that effect on the audience. Because years ago, no matter what films were, they weren't quite as graphic. And more so today, they are. So I'm wondering what your thinking was about that.
Well, as movies today go, this is a Disney movie, Tarantino was saying this is a romantic comedy, but I take violence very seriously. I turn down a lot of big action movies, a lot of Hollywood movies, because, for me, violence is people standing next to me being blown to bits, and I don't think one should be shy about violence. If you're involved with violence, it needs to be the way it is in real life, because otherwise you glorify it, and of course violence is a horrible thing, but this is what they dealt with. This was we actually had a really interesting incident. The guy who played the butcher was so far gone into the role that he insisted on standing by the camera when, remember, the British detective shoots him? So he he's not on the same frame, but he wanted to see, his own injury, even though it was fake. It's a movie. And the guy who played the British detective, kind of freaked, and instead of shooting down, he shot up, and he shot the actor in the face. and he punctured his face with thousands of little, charcoal things that he used as a stunt gun, and he almost lost his eyesight. And we spent all night in Tel HaShomer hospital, picking those things out of his face. And in Israel in those days, there was no computerized imagery. There was no models. The building that blows up is a building that we blew up. Those of you familiar with Tel Aviv, where Suzanne Dalal, the dance center, stands, used to be a high school. And the high school was demolished. And, on the day we shot, I think over 200 kilos of dynamite were rigged to that building. We built a set around it, and on a given day, we were to blow it up. And since the guy couldn't come back, they couldn't delay the explosion, and we were desperate. And as I was pacing back and forth, my DP said that I kind of looked like him from the back. So I spent the whole next day, doing stunts for my lead actor. And it's only in Israel, right? And so you see me on the long shot getting shot, and then you see him in close-up falling down. You see, and I remember I was crawling for the chicken wire at the end of the street, and it's not made out of rubber, it's the real thing. And I was completely covered with fake blood, but as I fell on the fence, it really ripped me to shreds, and my fake blood was mingling with my real blood, and I had the detonator in my hand. We had 6 cameras going, and I could blow the damn thing any time I wanted to, but I was lying there thinking, in the editing room, I probably could use a few more seconds of this. and everybody's saying, blow it up, blow it up, blow it up. And I'm waiting, and then I pull it, and I can see the whole building just fly up in the air in the glasses of Noah Kaplan. And for me, it's the consummate cinematic moment where the director crosses from one plane to another. So, yeah, it got pretty violent.
The previous speaker spoke about Rommel and the British. Well, there were not enough British to stop Rommel, so the question of leaving them there to confront Rommel. But I have another question. Would it have not been more effective if the Stern Gang, the Irgun, the Hagala, worked together rather than in separate ways?
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, right? It would be better if the Likud and all the other sane parties would work together and keep the nuts out of the Knesset. But that's not the way it happens in Israel. You're totally right. But the Irgun were, very much on the right. Haganah very much on the left. Totally different points of view. One believed in socialism, one believed in open market. Lehi was a combination of both. And basically they also fought each other. There was a time where, Haganah was hunting down the Irgun. So, of course, you're right. And, of course, it would be much better had they come together. But, the old story, if you have, wherever you have 2 Jews, you have 3 synagogues, right? Yeah, it's kind of a tragedy, but typical to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
No one knows. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.